Hi, this is Chris Young, and welcome to Good News on Tap for the 7th Sunday of Ordinary Time. We continue this week with more of the Sermon on the Mount, and with that very famous passage about turn the other cheek. Jesus offers this advice of non-retaliation in contrast to the Old Testament saying, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Even though I've read this passage many times, I never bothered to go back and look up the original saying. Turns out it comes from Leviticus 24, verse 20. The original intent of the statement was to moderate retaliation. It was supposed to prevent you from punishing someone more than was necessary. It was to mitigate retaliation, not to encourage it. Jesus, of course, throughout all of the Sermon on the Mount, is calling us to go above and beyond what is fair, to go beyond what you would normally expect, to be more generous and more forgiving than is necessary. It's only in his first of these examples that he deals with punishing evil. The remaining examples are all about going above and beyond the call of duty and to be generous. If someone asks you to go a mile with them, you should go 2 miles, for example. Probably the most difficult part of this passage is when Jesus says, love your enemies. Again, this is in contrast to the previous proverb of love your neighbor but hate your enemy. While the Old Testament does say we should love our neighbor, it doesn't really anywhere say hate your enemies. There are places in the Old Testament where people pray for the death of their enemies, and people naturally assumed that it was okay to hate their enemies. But the real message here is that your enemies are your neighbors. Prior to this statement by Jesus, people thought your neighbor was your countrymen, the people who were closest to you. Any outsiders were outside the rule of love your neighbor. The rule didn't apply to foreigners or to enemies or intruders. You didn't have to love them. They weren't your neighbors. Jesus is reminding us that we're all God's children, and therefore all neighbors to one another. So the love your neighbors rule does apply to our enemies. Now, if you want to see this week's gospel in action, you just need to watch the news about all the recent events in Egypt. A huge part of the success of the revolution in Egypt was the fact that the Egyptian army refused to turn on its own people. There were reports that there was also an amazing amount of religious tolerance among the protesters. Christian protesters would stand guard against the pro-government attackers, while the Muslims would hold their prayer services. And likewise, the Muslims would stand guard while the Christians prayed. I think that's part of why so many of the political analysts are surprised by the turn of events in the Middle East and North Africa. These are not the usual religious or sectarian kinds of revolutions that we've previously seen in this region. They've been revolutions about the people and not about ideology. That spirit of non-retaliation and peaceful resistance, embodied in the phrase turn the other cheek, has been manifest in the peaceful nature of these protests. The same thing is happening in Libya, although unfortunately there's been more violence there. Large portions of the Libyan army are defecting to be with the people rather than follow their corrupt leadership. Pilots have flown their aircraft to neutral countries rather than fire on their own people. They realize that they're all brothers and sisters together. The fact that these protesters throughout the region have done everything they can to remain peaceful and to love those who oppose them and recognize their kinship with them has meant that they're being rewarded by successful reforms that show great prospects for more freedom and democratic self-rule. This is the gospel in action. And that's Good News on Tap for the 7th Sunday of Ordinary Time.